So, Roosevelt, April 12th, 1945. Murder. I'm Breean Mansell, and today we'll be talking about the murder of Freddie D. Roosevelt. So, on April 12th, 1945, we were told FDR died, but was he murdered? So, JFK said the greatest enemy of truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. And FDR said, I'm a juggler, and I never let my right hand know what my left hand does. I'm perfectly willing to mislead and tell untruths. So let me ask you, when is the best time to kill a person? The answer is when they're dying. Here is a photo of FDR in 1933. And we see in 1945, it's just so much of a decline in that short period of time. Here's him in early 1944, and then in late 1944. I mean, you can really see the difference. So FDR was withholding the truth from the public, and like he said in the quote shown before, he was perfectly fine with doing that. All the time that FDR was president, he was paralyzed from the waist down, and he wore steel braces on his legs to stand and sit in a wheelchair while at the White House. Here's a photo of FDR when he had 2 months left to live, and him at Yalta in February of 1945. The premise: is it easy to murder a person who's already dying? Perfect plan or a mere coincidence? You decide. To seek out the truth here, let us not begin with April 12th, 1945, but February 1945 at the Yalta Conference. Who murdered FDR? We've been told all the lies for decades. Now it's time to answer some very pointed questions. Why did Eleanor Roosevelt suddenly, 12 years after FDR's death, hire a private investigator to probe his doctor's treatment methods? Why were all of FDR's medical records stolen from a locked filing cabinet at Bethesda Naval Hospital, which was ironically the same hospital that covered up so many facts during the JFK autopsy? Are we really expected to believe that FDR died of natural causes at the same time Allied troops were closing in on Hitler's bunker? Are we really expected to believe that Roosevelt, Hitler, and Mussolini all died within an 18-day span by coincidence? This book will change the way you look at World War II and President Roosevelt's death forever. It did not happen as we were told. Can you handle the truth? So at the Tehran Conference in December of 1943, FDR developed a racking cough and fatigue that wouldn't go away. He began to lose a lot of weight. Eleanor Roosevelt became concerned, and she alerted the White House physician and Surgeon General. But the general was an ear, a nose, and a throat specialist whose chief tasks were to relieve the president's almost constant sinus troubles and to be good company. The Roosevelt's daughter Anna demanded that the doctor schedule a thorough examination of the president. The doctor, McIntyre, arranged for Roosevelt to go to Bethesda Naval Hospital on March 27, 1944, and he selected cardiologist Dr. Howard Breean to do the examination. It revealed that FDR suffered from reduced lung capacity, high blood pressure, acute bronchitis, and congestive heart failure. In this report to Bethesda's commanding officer, Captain John Harper, Breean describes the results of the exam and recommends a period of rest, the use of digitalis to regulate the heart rhythm, dietary changes, and sedated sleep. Right here, we have a list of FDR's medical issues as of March 29th in 1944, when Dr. Breean diagnosed him with congestive heart failure. So FDR went to a train car acceptance speech in Chicago, and there was no question that Roosevelt would run for a fourth term. FDR believed that he had a duty to see the war through to the end. But it was clear to several leading Democratic politicians that Roosevelt was ill, and the question of his running mate became a hotly contested issue. Indeed, in early 1944, Dr. Frank Leahy, a highly respected internist from Boston who had been a part of the group that examined FDR in March, advised Surgeon General MacIntyre that he believed the president would not survive another full term in office. FDR did not attend the 1944 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Before departing Washington on a trip to California and Hawaii, he advised the convention chairman of his willingness to accept Senator Harry Truman as a running mate in place of Henry Wallace. On June 20th, FDR accepted the nomination in a radio address delivered from his train car in San Diego. The picture that appeared in the next day's newspapers horrified the White House because it showed a thin, slack-jawed FDR. The image fed rumors beginning to circulate about the president's health. So on November 6th, FDR made the last stop of his last presidential election. And here's a photo of FDR on January 20th of 1945 when he had less than 3 months to live. How did people fighting a world war, did almost 1 people become communists overnight? During the Yalta Conference, FDR gives away territory to Stalin. FDR's ambassador to China, Patrick Hurley, called FDR's secret agreement a blueprint for the communist conquest of China. Was FDR sick at Yalta? This is him at the beginning of his campaign. And here's him when he was in bad shape. So here you can read the memo that Frank Leahy wrote in 1944, where he predicts or states that FDR will die in office. And here is here's the memo where it's a little easier to read. Leahy said that he wrote this because, quote, in the light of having informed Admiral MacIntyre Saturday afternoon, July 8, 1944, that I did not believe that, if Mr. Roosevelt were elected president again, he had the physical capacity to complete a term. And then he continued to say, as I see my duty as a physician, I cannot violate my professional position nor possible professional confidence, but I do wish to be on record concerning possible later criticism. Basically, what he says here is that he doesn't think that FDR would survive 4 more years in the White House. Leahy went on to explain that the president had likely been on verge of heart failure in recent months as a result of high blood pressure. With this in mind, he wrote, it was my opinion that over the 4 years of another term with its burdens, he would have heart failure and be unable to complete it. According to the memo, MacIntyre agreed with his colleague's assessment. FDR was dying, but he could have lived months or years more. Several things were happening in a matter of months that FDR was not wanting and would have, if he had lived, tried to stop. So during this time, the war was ending and FDR wanted to cooperate with the USSR. He didn't want a Cold War. And Stalin knew about the cooperation and in fighting within the FDR administration. Stalin knew about the infighting within the FDR administration. He also knew that when Roosevelt left office, things would change between the USA and the USSR. In the late 1940s, FDR's son interviewed Stalin for an article. That is when Stalin told him his concerns with his father. Joseph Stalin had stopped trusting Eleanor Roosevelt completely when she refused to give permission for Andrei Gromyko to examine the body. If memory serves, the final viewing of FDR was a closed casket affair. According to Prouty, when son Elliot Roosevelt asked Stalin what Gromyko hoped to learn from the corpse of FDR, Stalin became furious. They poisoned your father, of course, just as they have tried to repeatedly poison me. Who are they? Asked Elliot Roosevelt. The Churchill gang, shouted Stalin. They poisoned your father, and they continue to try to poison me. So here's a quote of Stalin's thoughts during 1945 on FDR's death. Stalin distrusted all the people around FDR. He thought that FDR was a good person and that he had been poisoned by the Churchill. So, the short agreement between President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, dubbed the Hyde Park Item of War, was an attempt to ensure nuclear weapons would remain only in the U.S. and Great Britain's possession. Written in 1944, the agreement also reveals the plans of the two leaders to use the bomb against Japan, as well as Churchill's immense distrust of Niels Bohr. Truman is briefed on Manhattan Project April 25, 1945, or 2 weeks after becoming president. Why? When FDR was alive, Roosevelt gave a speech to the Pan American Scientific Congress where he discussed some of the moral concerns scientists had about wartime. Speaking about the ongoing war in Europe, he said, "What has come about has been caused solely by those who would use and are using the progress that you have made along the lines of peace in an entirely different cause." Even though FDR approved of the making of an atomic bomb, there is no evidence that he would have approved the use of such bombs in an actual war. It is interesting to note that ever since the first and second use of atomic weapons in the war, there has never been another use of such weapons. President Truman is the only president and only leader of the country to ever approve the use of such. They have them used not once but twice. After FDR's death, military considerations changed. The military situation on June 1st, 1945, when the Interim Committee submitted its recommendations on the use of the atomic bomb, was distinctly favorable to the Allied cause. The official order to drop the bomb was 1. The Secretary of War and the Secretary of State advised Truman to use the bomb. Spring and summer of 1945, Truman approves of the decision. The decision was non-interference. Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz requested a written order. Official order was issued on July 25th. Here's a photo of the atomic bomb and then its results. And then the destruction in Japan. So we'll link this video where President Truman comments on the atomic bomb. But the third point against the establishing Israel FDR with the King of Saudi Arabia is that on his way home from the Yalta Conference in declining health, Franklin Roosevelt stopped in Saudi Arabia to meet with King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. Roosevelt's intention was to persuade the Saudi king to support Jewish immigration to Palestine. FDR changed the king's mind. King Abdul Aziz slaughtered a goat on deck for their meal, then proceeded to convince Roosevelt to abandon his plans of supporting the Jewish homeland. Apparently, FDR did it for oil. The Saudi king persuaded the allying Roosevelt to make a secret oil for security agreement where the United States would supply military assistance, training, and a built military base in Arabia in exchange for secure access to Saudi oil. In an April 5, 1945 letter, the Saudi king followed back up with Roosevelt, who wrote back, promising that the United States would not recognize a Jewish state. 1 week later, Roosevelt was dead. The letter from the President Roosevelt to King Ibn Saud says, "Great and good friend, I have received the communication which your Majesty sent me under date March 10th, 1945, in which you refer to the question of Palestine and the continuing interest of Arabs in the current developments affecting that country. I am gratified that your Majesty took this occasion to bring your views on this question to my attention, and I have given the most careful attention to the statements which you make in your letter. I am also mindful of the memorable conversation which we had not so long ago, and in the course of which I had an opportunity to obtain so vivid an impression of your Majesty's sentiments on this question. It gives me pleasure to renew to your majesty the assurances which you have previously received regarding the attitude of my government and my own as chief executive with regard to the questions of Palestine, and to inform you that the policy of this government in this respect is unchanged. I desire also at this time to send you my best wishes for your majesty's continued good health and for the welfare of your people. FDR plot sounds a lot like a plot that will be used almost 20 years later. On the occasion of the 67th anniversary of Israel, Robbie Benjamin Bleach wrote, "We can now see divine fingerprints in the replacement of FDR with Harry S. Truman, a man who previously enjoyed a friendly business relationship with a Jew and found himself in the unique position of being able to make possible the creation of the state of Israel, which his predecessor pledged never to allow." When Truman became president, though, things were different. Truman wrote in his memoirs, "The question of Palestine as a Jewish homeland goes back to the solemn promise that had been made to them by the British in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, a promise which had stirred the hopes and the dreams of these oppressed people. This promise, I felt, should be kept, just as all promises made by reasonable, civilized governments should be kept." And here's a video of Truman recognizing Israel that will also be linked. There will not be another world war. Roosevelt formed a military alliance with Great Britain to win the war against Hitler's Third Reich, but he had plans to create a different world after the war, a world without colonialism. He was aware of the danger that unless colonialism were finally eradicated, another world war was virtually inevitable. Unfortunately, Roosevelt's grand design for the creation of new independent nations to populate the world did not come to be after the war due to Truman's capitulation to the British. Roosevelt's understanding of the threat posed to world peace by the continuation of imperialism was recorded by his son Eliot in his book As He Saw It. FDR told his son, quote, "The colonial system means war. Exploit the resources of an India, a Burma, a Java. Take all the wealth out of these countries and never put anything back into them. Things like education, decent standards of living, minimum health requirements. All you're doing is storing up the kind of trouble that leads to war. All you're doing is negating the value of any kind of organizational structure for peace before it begins." At the Casablanca Conference in January of 1943, Roosevelt was even more empathetic. "I'm talking about another war. I'm talking about what will happen to our world if after this war we allow millions of people to slide back into the semi-slavery. Don't think for a moment, Eliot, that Americans would be dying in the Pacific tonight if it hadn't been for the short-sighted greed of the French and the British and the Dutch. Shall we allow them to do it all over again? Your son will be right about age 15 or 20 years from now." Here were Roosevelt's guiding principles. The first was equality of opportunity for youth and others. Second is jobs for those who can work. Third, security for those who need it. And the ending of special privilege for the few. Fifth was the preservation of civil liberties for all. And sixth was the enjoyment of the fruits of scientific progress and a wider and constantly rising standard of living. The four freedoms were, the first was the freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is for every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is economic understandings which will secure every nation a healthy peacetime for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth was a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. FDR was against colonies. He said, "I'm by no means sure in my own mind that we'd be right to return France her colonies at all ever, without first obtaining some sort of pledge, or just exactly what was planned." After April 12th, we forgot that we were anti-British. Why did some want Truman as president? Because of changes in the world. Roosevelt was laying to the groundwork to continue the Big Three alliance after the war, but his death in April from a brain aneurysm changed things in a day. Harry Truman, who had been vice president for only 3 months, had been kept in the dark about Roosevelt's plans. Soon, took a hard line against the Soviet Union. So in the 1940 election, Garner 2 times and out, and Wallace came in. Then in 1944, it was different. Wallace was out and Truman was in. In 1944, there was a power struggle to get rid of Wallace. Dewey would be hard to beat by anyone else but FDR. And Truman didn't want to take the position. This is what the people knew. The Vice President Wallace, during 1944, was a hero to both organized labor and the increasingly powerful African American communities in America's biggest cities. But among the Democratic elite, opposing to him was even more fervent than it had been in 1940. They did not know that FDR was dying. Truman was not the first choice. James Byrnes was. Byrnes was also a racist with a record. Byrnes' views of race were fully reflective of his South Carolina roots. He had once opposed federal anti-lynching laws on the grounds that lynching was an effective means to, quote, hold in check the Negro in the South. He was a congressman, senator, Supreme Court justice, Secretary of Office, Mobilization, Secretary of State, Governor of South Carolina. The decision was made. Kingmakers met with FDR and convinced him that neither Wallace nor Byrnes would be acceptable running mates. He signed off to their compromise choice, Truman. The convention presented a slight problem. Wallace had the support of a majority of delegates, as well as the overwhelming majority of Democrats around the nation. A Gallup poll in 1944 found that 65% of Democrats supported Wallace as FDR's running mate, while the relatively unknown Truman earned support from just 2%. The time for a VP nomination came. In the end, the fix was in. Truman won. Senator Harry S. Truman said in early 1944, "The vice president simply presides over the Senate and sits around hoping for a funeral." On January 12, 1945, Secret Service rushed him to the White House. Harry S. Truman, a former senator from Missouri, got the news at the Capitol. The Secret Service rushed him to the White House, where he was sworn in by Chief Justice Harlan Stone. "I felt as though the moon and the stars and all the planets fell on me last night when I got the news," Truman told reporters the next day. "I have the most terribly responsible job any man ever had." But Truman was in the dark. Clearly, in the end, what are we left with? FDR's policies were completely overturned by Truman. Truman was put in as vice president as a patsy. FDR was a very sick person. And FDR's death on April 12, 1945 was far from natural causes. The method, motives, and cover will be used again less than 20 years later. More information on our next broadcast on this subject next month.